Hey all, you're about to see a really interesting clash of two legendary chess champions, Anatoly Karpov playing white versus Mikhail playing black. The game starts with pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight c3, d5 and d4 transposed into the Slav defense. And what makes this game really interesting is that these two players had a really opposite style. While Karpov was a master of positional play, Tal is known as one of the greatest masters of attack of all time. And that's why it's really interesting to see how these two players play against each other. So far I don't comment too much on the moves because it's just development moves. Black created this central setup of pawns, which is on the one hand gives him a very good protection against any potential white's attacking attempts, while on the other hand it also gives black a lot of potential opportunities for a counterattack. And even right now Tal starts to play more aggressively. So he captures the pawn on c4 first with the idea to push his pawn to b5 on the next move. It's one of the classical ideas known since the times of Rubinstein, and other famous masters of the past. And the idea of black is that on the one hand it prepares potential development of black's bishop to b7, the fianchetto win of the bishop, and on the other hand in the future black is ready to push his pawn to c5 and counterattacking the white center. Let's see exactly how this happened. White played bishop d3, black played a6, preparing the c5 advancement so that the b5 pawn would be protected afterwards and white cannot capture it. White plays pawn to e4. Ideally speaking, white would love to have this kind of ideal pawn setup in the center where he has two pawns in the center while black has nothing. But of course Tal does not want this situation to happen, so he counterblows immediately with pawn to c5, trying to destroy the white's pawn center. In positions like that, it's natural for players to start thinking like, should I take that pawn on c5 or should I let black take this pawn on d4? But one great characteristic of champions is that they do not want to follow with their opponent's plan. They much rather would prefer to break the opponent's plan and instead push their own plan. And I think it's one of the good takeaways for you. Whenever your opponent is trying to do something, think about the way to break his plan and do something different instead. Just like in this position, if black wants to trade off these pawns and destroy the white center, white wants to do something different. And that's why white played pawn to d5. He wants to keep his central pawn, which gives him some space advantage, etc. And black, interestingly enough, also does not want to react to the white's move. He plays c4 with a counter blow. So as the white took d takes e6, counterattacking the knight on e6 while black just attacked this bishop on d3. You just can see how these both great champions always try to counter blow and push their own plan, not letting their opponent to lead the game. Black took the bishop on d3, white recaptured the knight, and black here captured with a queen so that he can protect this pawn on d3, because so far it's actually an extra pawn of black and he wants to keep it if possible. White cannot take the pawn back right now, so he just castles. Black plays bishop b7. If you remember, it was one of the ideas for the black's pawn advancement to b5 to fianchetto the bishop on b7, where it stands on this long diagonal, very active. And I think it's an interesting position to make one remark which I think can be extremely useful for you. One of the most common questions that I receive from students is how to have stable results, because a lot of players struggle from winning some great games, but on the other hand losing annoying games after making blunders or being in time trouble. Have you ever been in a situation like that? And Karpov was really brilliant in having stable results. At his peak, he very rarely lost games, and I think this position actually explains why. For example, how would you play here as white? There are a number of choices. For example, white can try going knight e5 to attack the queen on d7 and at the same time to hoping to get back that pawn on d3. Now that is one option. But the downside is that the black's queen does not have to retreat. It can actually go forward onto d4, attacking the knight, and now when the knight takes the pawn on d3, black can continue attacking and play rook d8, putting some unpleasant pressure on white along the d file. Now, there is nothing really bad for white here, as the white's queen on d1 is protected and white may just retreat with his knight, but nevertheless it gives black some activity, and that is what Karpov usually tried to avoid. He said a really interesting thing once in his interview. He said that if he sees that there is a certain best move, he would do it no matter how risky it is. But if there are a few opportunities which are approximately equal, he would choose a safer one, which does not let his opponent to play actively. So in this case, knight e5 was a fine move, it's a decent option, but it would give black some active play, which Karpov does not want. Another interesting question is like, should white worry about the black's idea to take the white's pawn on e4? I mean, maybe it's a threat, maybe not, because white would continue with rook to e1 and pin the knight along the e-file, but at the same time it again leads to some unclear variations, and so Karpov wanted to just stop that, and he played rook to e1. Now the good advantage of this move is that it basically does not give any active opportunities for black, and at the same time it's a useful move because the rook anyway stands well on e1. It might help white in various continuations in the future in case white wants to push the pawn, or if white decides to jump with knight to d5 at some point. So in various variations the rook stands well here, and that's why Karpov played that move. So again, I wanted to stop by at this point just to highlight that great idea that if you have a choice, play the best move. While if you think that there are a few good options, you can choose a safer one. Alright, let's move on. Black played bishop b4. Tal, true to his style, always tries to play more actively and placing his pieces forward, but at the same time here Karpov noticed that he can at this point play knight to e5, and then the advantage of this move at this point is that on the next move, when white captures the pawn on d3, not only he takes back this pawn, but he would also attack the black's bishop on b4. Therefore, in this position, this maneuver is even stronger for white. Tal played queen to e6. White recaptured with the knight, simultaneously attacking the bishop, and black took here on c3. Now, this position, of course, a lot of players would automatically recapture b takes c3, but there is this one tip of advice that I always give to people: before playing your moves, always think what your opponent is going to do next. And in this position, if white recaptures with a pawn, which is a decent option, but black has an interesting continuation. Here, instead of making short castling, he can go in the queenside castling, and this allows him to bring his rook into play with a tempo, while simultaneously protecting his king. And even though it may seem like the black's king is somewhat exposed on the queen side, but you can notice how active black's pieces are. Especially this pin on the d-file is very annoying. Black is also ready to take on e4 with one of his pieces, and well, it's not that it's like super dangerous for white, but it is becomes somewhat unpleasant. And that is why in the previous move, instead of recapturing the bishop automatically, Karpov played an intermediate move, knight to f4. Now, it's not a piece sacrifice because the knight is attacking the queen, so white is just postponing recapturing the bishop to the next move. And again, that's one of the great characteristics of Karpov. He always, wanted to make sure that his opponent does not have active opportunities, because if you get into the position like that, just like we discussed earlier, if white will recapture and black made this long castling, there is nothing wrong with the white's position yet, but it just becomes a lot more dangerous, and potentially black can start creating some threats, and you would have to think about it, and there is a greater opportunity for you to make a mistake. Whereas if we come back to the actual game continuation where white plays knight f4, it's a simple position, and there are much fewer opportunities for white to get into trouble. Recently, we have just finalized a complete course about Karpov called Karpov's Positional Style Revealed, and for that course we analyzed a ton of different games, and I've noticed that this is a usual pattern in his games. He kind of always tried to foresee an opponent's attacking opportunities and prevent them before they even happened, which allowed him again to be super consistent and either to win games or to make draws, but to very rarely lose games. Alright, let's go next. Tal replied with queen to d7. White recaptured the bishop, and here Tal decided to take the pawn on e4 because, well, white has an extra pawn at the moment, this e4 pawn, and white can protect it, of course, in the future or push it forward, so Tal decided that it's time to get it back. White traded off the queens, and here there's another interesting moment of this game. Usually, in an endgame, there is no opportunity to attack opponent's king anymore, just because usually you deliver a checkmate with your queen, and therefore once queens are traded off, it's usually difficult to deliver a checkmate. But in this particular position, Karpov played just like you would normally do in a middle game. He wants to chase an opponent's exposed king in the center, and that's why he played bishop to a3, which cuts off the king and does not let him to run away on the king side, together with, of course, the white's knight controlling the e6 square, the white's rook controlling the e file, and so white is kind of ready to join his forces into the attack. Tata played rook to e8 to bring his rook into play, and Karpov replied rook to d1, he wants to attack the black's king. You may wonder why white didn't play with his rook a to d1, and the point is that white noticed that the black's king anyway cannot go back to the e file because all the squares here are already controlled by the white's pieces, and therefore he played rook e to d1 so that once the king goes to c7, as he did, in the future the white's rook can join somewhere along the c file or on the queen side. However, right now the c file is closed, so first he plays pawn to f3 to kick off the black's knight from the white's territory, which is always a good idea. Now, black certainly cannot take this pawn because after that the knight will be pinned. White will be able to play rook to c1 and then to grab this knight in the future. So the knight has to retreat back, which is what happened. Tata played knight to f6. Now white continues attacking the black's king, bishop d6 check, king goes to b6, and here Karpov played kinda in a tile style. He played c4, offering a pawn sacrifice to open up the lines around the black's king. And it turns out that black really cannot take this pawn because after that he's losing right away. In this case, it allows white to play rook to b1, which is check, king a7 is forced, then white continues bishop c5, king goes back to b8, and it's actually a really interesting position. How would you finalize the white's attack here? Ideally speaking, white would love to play rook to d7, because in that case it would allow white to almost knock out black right away, because the two rooks would attack the black's bishop b7 and therefore the king. But the problem is the d7 square is currently controlled by the knight, which gives white an idea to deflect this knight, and therefore the winning move is, can you find it? It's knight to h5, deflecting the knight, and after that rook to d7, and then rook comes to b7 inevitably on the next move, and the black's king is going to be checkmated soon. Therefore, this variation would be losing for black, but Tata certainly saw these variations, and he did not allow white to do this. So after white pushed his pawn to c4, black, instead of accepting this pawn sacrifice, played rook to c8, which looks a lot more logical. Black is bringing his least active piece into play, and white traded off the pawns on b5 and continues his plan by playing pawn to a4. The white's plan is still the same. He wants to open the lines against the black's queen and then continue his attack. And here black is already somewhat in trouble, because right now he already cannot stop white from opening the lines on the queen side, which would bring a lot of pressure onto black's king. So he tried to play rook to d8. Probably black was not exactly sure what to do here. White takes the pawn on b5, and black decided to try to use the white's own pawn on b5 as a shield, which protects black's king from checks along the b file. So black played rook to d7. Can you notice what is black's intention here? Black wants to double rooks over the d file and to attack the white's bishop and potentially the white's rook on d1. And here there is another really great thing that Karpov did. He played rook to d4, and that's one more takeaway that I would love to share with you. Karpov always tried to keep his pieces protecting each other, because while doing so you minimize the chances for blunder, minimizes the chances for losing one of your pieces. This is just an overprotection, which again prevents any sudden mistakes which you can possibly make in the future. Black played rook d8, attacking the bishop. White supported the bishop by another rook. So black realized that this idea failed and he plays rook to c8. And now white just plays bishop to e5. Sometimes players are not sure what to do in an endgame, because if there is no way to attack opponent's king, then you may wonder, like, then what can you attack? But the answer is, in an endgame you need to attack opponent's pawns, because after you grab opponent's pawns you can push your pawns forward, promote a new queen, and then you'll win the game easily. And therefore Karpov plays bishop to e5 with an idea that in case black takes the rook, which is probably a bad idea, white would recapture with the bishop, check, the black's king has to take the pawn probably, and then white can exchange the bishop on f6, breaking black's pawn structure, then going rook to d7, and this rook will easily collect all of the black's pawns on the king side in the future. Therefore, Tal certainly understood that it's going to be losing for him against Karpov, who was a very strong endgame player in particular. So Karpov did something different instead. Tal played rook to e7, trying to keep more pieces on the board and complicate the situation, but it allows white to continue his main plan, attack of an opponent's king. White played rook d6, king takes b5, rook to b1 check, king c4, rook to d4 check, and you can obviously see that the black's king is in big trouble, and at this point black already resigned because he calculated that, the checkmate is unavoidable. For example, in the line like this, white can go rook c1, rook b4, rook a1, it's almost like a linear mate, and black goes bishop a6, bishop d4 check, king a8, and rook takes a6. Probably there were more options for white to continue to his attack, is just one of them, but it was pretty obvious that white can now attack black's king in multiple different ways, so black just resigned. I hope that you enjoyed this really interesting game between two legendary champions, Karpov and Tal. I think that it's also very interesting how in this game Karpov managed to combine playing safely while at the same time playing aggressively, which is like an ideal style of playing chess where you maximize your chances for winning and minimize your chances of losing. And if you want to know more about this kind of style and how you can play exactly like Karpov did, you can check out the link down below where you can find the complete course Karpov's Positional Style Revealed, where we break down all of the techniques and strategies used by Karpov to achieve the phenomenal results that he achieved. Hope you enjoyed the game. Have a great day. Bye bye.